September 7, 1940, Southern England. At precisely 4:43 p.m., air raid sirens wailed across London for the third time that day. From the Channel coast to the outskirts of the capital, more than 300 German bombers and fighters crossed into British airspace in tight formation. It was the height of the Blitz, and the Luftwaffe expected another easy victory. Most of the German fighter pilots had begun calling Britain's Hawker Hurricanes fliegender Schrott, flying junk. To them, the Hurricane was outdated, slow, and crudely built compared to their sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109s. Many believed that the real danger came only from the newer Spitfires. But within a week, that perception would collapse completely. When the Luftwaffe's daylight raids began in August 1940, the German High Command believed the RAF was on the verge of collapse. Intelligence reports claimed that British fighter production couldn't keep pace with losses. What those reports failed to understand was that while the Spitfire dominated headlines, it was the Hurricane that formed the backbone of fighter command. Out of every 3 frontline fighters defending Britain, 2 were Hurricanes. At the sector station of Northolt, No. 303 Squadron, made up of Polish pilots who had escaped through France, was preparing for its second sortie of the day. Their Hurricanes looked unremarkable. Fabric-covered wings patched from previous battles, bullet holes crudely sealed with doped canvas. Yet these aircraft and the men flying them would soon change the course of the air war. Across the Channel, Jagdgeschwader 26, JG-26, led by the experienced Oberst Adolf Galland, was confident. The squadron had faced Hurricanes before and dismissed them as obsolete. The 109's superior climb rate and speed allowed German pilots to dive, fire, and escape before the Hurricanes could respond. What Galland didn't realize was that RAF tactics were changing. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and Keith Park, commanding No. 11 Group, had ordered Hurricane units to focus exclusively on bombers, leaving the Spitfires to duel with escorting fighters. The decision would soon exploit a critical weakness in German planning. At 4:57 p.m., radar stations along the southern coast picked up multiple raids heading toward London. Controllers at Fighter Command's Bentley Priory ordered 12 squadrons into the air. Among them was No. 303 Squadron, scrambled from Northolt at 5 p.m. Flight Lieutenant John Kent, a Canadian, led the flight. His Polish pilots, veterans of the campaigns in Poland and France, climbed into formation at 16,000 feet over the Thames estuary. Below them, waves of Dornier Do-17 and Heinkel He-111 bombers approached in perfect V formations, escorted by dozens of Messerschmitt 109s. The first clash came minutes later. As the German bombers began their bombing run toward London's docks, the Hurricanes attacked from above and behind, the bombers' blind spot. Their 8.303 Browning machine guns unleashed dense streams of fire. Within seconds, 3 Dorniers were burning. German radio chatter erupted in confusion. The escorts tried to dive in, but Spitfire squadrons from Hornchurch intercepted them, pulling the 109s away. The Hurricanes pressed on, slashing through the bomber formations in coordinated pairs. By the end of that sortie, 303 Squadron alone claimed 14 bombers destroyed, without losing a single aircraft. German crews were stunned. The supposedly inferior Hurricanes had appeared suddenly from cloud cover, attacked with deadly precision, and vanished. In the raid's aftermath, Luftwaffe intelligence dismissed the losses as exaggerated British propaganda. Yet over the next 7 days, the same pattern repeated across the southeast of England. Hurricane squadrons from Biggin Hill, Tangmere, and Debden began using what pilots called the beam attack, approaching from the side of bomber formations where defensive gunners were weakest. The Hurricane's heavier frame and wide turning radius once considered disadvantages, actually gave them stability when firing long bursts into bomber columns. The German fighter escorts couldn't cover every direction at once, and the Hurricanes exploited that weakness relentlessly. By September 13th, the Luftwaffe's daily operational reports showed an alarming trend. Between September 7th and September 14th, German forces had lost over 50 aircraft in the London sector alone, the majority to Hurricane squadrons. Many of these were bombers destroyed before reaching their targets. In just 1 week, the old junk had become the Luftwaffe's most effective enemy. At the German airfields in Pas-de-Calais, pilots began to notice changes in tone. Messerschmitt mechanics reported that several returning fighters had been riddled with holes, not from Spitfires, but from Hurricanes. They hit hard, one pilot admitted in his logbook. Not fast, but always there, always coming back. Behind these numbers was a shift in morale. The RAF's ground crews worked tirelessly through the night, repairing damaged Hurricanes, rearming guns, patching fuselages. The aircraft were simple to fix, often ready to fly again within hours. Unlike the Spitfire, whose sleek elliptical wings required skilled labor and precision machining, the Hurricane structure was built on a tubular steel frame covered in fabric and metal panels. A hole could be patched with canvas and glue. A new wing could be bolted on in a field hangar. That practicality kept the squadrons flying. Every day, fresh Hurricanes returned to the skies. Every day, more German crews failed to return. Inside Luftwaffe II headquarters, General Marshal Albert Kesselring demanded explanations. How could an inferior enemy aircraft inflict such losses? His staff pointed to pilot fatigue, extended escort range, and British radar coordination. Few dared to mention that the underestimated Hurricane, the machine the Luftwaffe had mocked for months, was now responsible for most of their destroyed bombers. For the RAF, the week between September 7th and 14th marked a critical turning point. While London burned and civilians sought shelter underground, the fighter squadrons above were bleeding the Luftwaffe dry. It wasn't elegant and it wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. By mid-September, German bomber crews began calling the Hurricanes Feuerjäger, fire hunters. The insult "old junk" quietly disappeared from squadron slang. The aircraft the Germans had laughed at was now forcing them to retreat. And as one Luftwaffe officer later wrote in his report, "The Hurricanes are not beautiful, but they do not die." By the morning of September 15, 1940, the battle over southern England reached its breaking point. The Luftwaffe, believing the RAF to be near collapse, launched one of its largest coordinated raids of the war. Across the Channel, airfields from Calais to Cherbourg roared to life. Bombers were fueled, fighters armed, and briefings issued with a clear objective: cripple London once and for all. At 11 a.m., radar screens at Fighter Command headquarters lit up with multiple inbound formations. Operators counted wave after wave, more than 600 aircraft heading toward the Thames estuary, the largest concentration yet. Every squadron within reach was ordered to scramble. At North Weald, No. 56 Squadron's Hurricanes lifted off in pairs, their engines leaving trails of exhaust across the morning haze. The men had barely slept. Most had flown 2, sometimes 3 sorties a day for weeks. Yet despite exhaustion, morale remained surprisingly high. The pilots knew something the Luftwaffe didn't, that the Hurricanes, dismissed as relics, were now responsible for most of their destroyed bombers. The aircraft were patched, stained, and loud. The smell of hot oil and cordite clung to the cockpit glass. Yet for pilots like Flight Lieutenant Bob Stanford Tuck, the Hurricane felt more like a weapon than a machine. It could take punishment, he later said. You could feel it fighting back with you. By 11:20, the first formations appeared over the coast. Dornier DO-17s in tight V-shapes, escorted by Bf 109s flying high above them in protective arcs. The Germans believed the RAF would be unable to intercept in strength, that its fighter reserves were nearly spent. They were wrong. From Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, and Northolt, hurricanes began to converge on the bombers from multiple directions. Unlike the earlier weeks of the battle, coordination between squadrons was now seamless. Ground controllers, guided by radar, directed each flight to the right altitude and vector. It was Dowding's system in full effect, a network of radar, observers, and command centers that allowed hurricanes to strike with precision. At 12,000 feet over Gravesend, the first engagement erupted. Number 303 Squadron dove straight into a bomber column, their tracers cutting through the morning haze. German gunners opened fire, but the Hurricanes absorbed the hits and kept pressing. One Polish pilot, Sergeant Józef Frontizek, closed within 50 yards of a Dornier before firing a burst that shredded its tail section. The bomber fell apart in midair, scattering debris across the countryside. Below, civilians stared up from rooftops and fields, watching the sky turn into a mosaic of contrails, flashes, and falling aircraft. The noise was constant, the scream of engines, the stutter of machine guns, the deep thud of exploding ordnance. For many Londoners, it was the first time they saw hurricanes chasing bombers almost directly above the city. At the same time, over the Thames, number 229 Squadron intercepted a group of Heinkel HE-11s bound for the London docks. Their leader, Squadron Leader Tom Gleave, ordered his flight into a head-on attack, a suicidal move by conventional standards. The Hurricanes met the bombers nose first, firing in unison before breaking away at the last second. One Heinkel disintegrated in flames. Another turned sharply, losing formation. The rest scattered. German formation discipline began to break down. Pilots who once viewed hurricanes as easy prey now found themselves overwhelmed by their persistence. A hurricane might not catch a Bf-109 in level flight, but it could outturn it, and its guns were devastating at close range. Once a hurricane latched onto a bomber, it rarely missed. Inside one of the Luftwaffe's command bunkers near Boulogne, radio operators struggled to make sense of the chaos. Reports came in erratically, bombers missing, escorts separated, formations broken. Oberst Galland, commanding JG-26, realized his pilots were being drawn away again, forced into dogfights with Spitfires while the Hurricanes decimated the bombers below. "They're slaughtering the Heinkels," he told his adjutant. By midday, the skies above London resembled a massive, rolling battlefront. Hurricanes attacked in waves, peeling off, refueling, and returning again. Mechanics at satellite airfields worked frantically to rearm the aircraft as soon as they landed. Ammunition belts replaced, fuel hoses jammed into ports, bullet holes hastily patched with tape. Many Hurricanes took off again within 15 minutes of landing. At 1 p.m., the second major German wave arrived. This time, the Hurricanes met them farther south, above the Kent countryside. Pilots described seeing the sunlight glint off hundreds of aircraft, like a swarm of insects across the sky. The British defenders split their attacks into two layers. Spitfires engaged the high-flying escorts, while Hurricanes dove through the bomber columns. In one of the most intense engagements of the battle, number 1 Squadron's Hurricanes fought for nearly 40 minutes without pause. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty, engines overheated, and still they stayed in the fight. When the ammunition ran out, some pilots performed mock attack dives just to scatter the bomber formations. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. By evening, more than 50 German aircraft were destroyed or missing, a figure confirmed by post-mission reconnaissance. British losses totaled fewer than 30. For the first time, the balance had shifted decisively. At the end of the day, Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited the underground operations room at Uxbridge, where Fighter Command staff tracked the battle in real time. As reports of confirmed kills came in, one officer quietly told him, "We've done it, sir." Churchill simply nodded. "Never in the field of human conflict," he later said, "was so much owed by so many to so few." But what he didn't mention, at least not publicly, was that the majority of those few were sitting in Hurricanes. While the Spitfire became the symbol of British defiance, it was the Hurricane that bore the brunt of the fighting. Over the course of that critical week, Hurricanes accounted for nearly two-thirds of all enemy aircraft destroyed. They defended the convoys, attacked bombers, and absorbed the damage that would have crippled more delicate fighters. For the Luftwaffe, the loss of 50 aircraft in a single week was a disaster. It exposed fundamental flaws in their strategy, overconfidence, underestimation of the enemy, and a fatal misunderstanding of British resilience. Luftwaffe intelligence had assumed that the RAF would prioritize its Spitfires, keeping the older Hurricanes in reserve. Instead, the reverse happened. The old junk had become the front line. In intercepted German communications, RAF analysts began to notice a shift in tone. Pilots who once mocked the Hurricane now referred to it with grudging respect. One message, decoded days later at Bletchley Park, read, "These machines fight like iron. They burn, yet they keep flying." On the ground, the British aircraft factories that produced the Hurricanes ran day and night. The design's simplicity allowed mass production even under bombardment. At Hawker's Langley plant, workers hammered out new fuselages in hangars patched with tarpaulin after air raids. Women worked beside former taxi drivers and apprentices, assembling control cables, bolting on engine mounts, and sending fresh aircraft straight to the front within days. That was the Hurricane's greatest weapon, not speed or glamour, but resilience. It could be built anywhere, repaired anywhere, and flown by anyone with courage. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't revolutionary. But it was, as one RAF mechanic put it, a fighter that refused to die. By the end of that week, Luftwaffe pilots no longer underestimated what they were facing. They began to realize that the Hurricane's crude construction wasn't a flaw. It was a design born of necessity, perfectly suited to the kind of war Britain was fighting. For every German aircraft that crossed the Channel, another Hurricane was waiting, patched, battered, and still flying. And as the losses mounted, the phrase that once echoed through German airfields, "old junk," disappeared altogether. Through the following days, the situation across South England reached a level of intensity neither side had faced before. The Luftwaffe, stunned by the losses it had taken, attempted to regain control through relentless pressure. Between September 16th and 21st, bomber formations continued to cross the Channel almost daily, each one larger and more desperate than the last. Their objective was simple: force the RAF to collapse by attrition. Yet what they encountered was an opponent whose endurance seemed limitless, held together not by numbers but by discipline and adaptability. For the RAF, this week was defined by exhaustion. Pilots slept in their cockpits, sometimes with engines still warm from their last sortie. Mechanics worked through the night under dim lamps, patching holes with scrap metal and canvas. Replacement parts were scarce, and fuel supplies were stretched thin. Yet every morning when the first radar blips appeared over Dover, the Hurricanes went up again. In many squadrons, the aircraft were held together by improvisation. No. 501 Squadron, based at Gravesend, used aluminum from destroyed enemy aircraft to repair their own wings. The paint schemes were inconsistent. Some Hurricanes flew with half the fuselage still in primer. Others bore mismatched roundels from different units. But none of that mattered. They still climbed, fought, and came back, ready to do it again. On the 17th, German command shifted its focus from London to the RAF's sector stations. The Luftwaffe intended to cripple Fighter Command's infrastructure, believing it to be stretched beyond recovery. Airfields like Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Tangmere became the new targets. Yet the plan underestimated one crucial factor: the speed with which British ground crews could restore operations. At Biggin Hill, 2 direct hits destroyed the operations block and set fire to parked Hurricanes. The control tower was gutted, and communications went down completely. For several hours, the airfield was declared out of action. But by evening, temporary radio sets were installed, and a new control center was established in an underground shelter. The next morning, Hurricanes from No. 79 Squadron were airborne again. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance photos, taken days later, showed the airfield operational. The German High Command refused to believe it. Intelligence analysts marked the images inaccurate. Yet what they failed to understand was that the Hurricane's very design made such recovery possible. Its wooden frame and fabric skin allowed repairs that could be completed with basic tools. Where a Spitfire needed specialized workshops, a Hurricane could be fixed with little more than sheet metal, glue, and determination. Meanwhile, the pilots flying them began to master tactics that turned the aircraft's limitations into strengths. Instead of climbing to meet high-altitude escorts, Hurricanes stayed low, focusing entirely on bomber interception. They attacked from below, using cloud cover and sun glare to their advantage. German bomber crews expecting frontal assaults were caught off guard when tracer fire suddenly tore through their bellies from unseen attackers. One Luftwaffe survivor later recalled, "They came from nowhere. We thought they were finished, yet every time we crossed the coast, the Hurricanes appeared again." By September 18th, German radio traffic showed growing confusion. Formation discipline collapsed faster with each mission. Bombers returning to base often arrived in scattered groups, their escorts missing or out of fuel. The Bf-109s, limited by their short range, could not stay over Britain for long. Once they turned back, the Hurricanes moved in unopposed. The result was a grim routine. Bombers crossing the channel, suffering losses, and limping home half destroyed. In a single raid on the 19th, over 20 German aircraft failed to return. British radar operators reported continuous signals of aircraft turning back before even reaching their targets. The psychological toll on Luftwaffe crews was immediate. The RAF's persistence shattered the assumption that British defenses were on the verge of collapse. Intercepted messages described pilots refusing to fly certain missions. One bomber commander was recorded saying, "The English old planes fight harder than anything we have met before." For the British public, those days were chaos. London burned nightly, but during daylight, the sight of Hurricanes still circling overhead provided a fragile sense of security. Newspapers printed stories of pilots returning in aircraft so damaged that they seemed impossible to land. One report described a Hurricane missing half a wing that still managed to touch down safely at Croydon. Another landed with its undercarriage jammed and one aileron shot away. At Hawkinge, a ground crew discovered that a pilot from No. 303 Squadron had returned with 73 bullet holes in his aircraft, yet the engine still ran. When asked how it was possible, the mechanic simply said, "Because it's a Hurricane." As losses mounted, Luftwaffe intelligence began re-evaluating the aircraft they had dismissed. Reports circulated through German command channels describing the Hurricane's stability under fire, its ability to dive without structural failure, and its rugged landing gear that allowed it to operate from damaged airfields. The aircraft that had once been considered obsolete now appeared to be Britain's most durable defense asset. But inside Fighter Command, the strain was unmistakable. Many squadrons were down to half their operational strength. Replacement pilots arrived straight from training schools, some with only 10 hours of flight experience on Hurricanes. Veteran leaders like Douglas Bader and Stanford Tuck took them under their wing, often pairing rookies with experienced pilots during sorties to keep them alive. Still, the system held. Every raid that crossed the Channel met resistance. Every bomber that reached London paid a price. By the 20th, Luftwaffe High Command began to realize that their campaign was no longer sustainable. Attrition was draining their strength faster than anticipated. Over the previous 7 days, more than 50 German aircraft had been lost, the highest weekly total since the campaign began. Worse still, they had little to show for it. British Fighter Command, far from destroyed, remained fully operational. For the first time since the start of the war, German field commanders questioned Göring's leadership. His promise that England's air defense will collapse within weeks had turned hollow. At squadron briefings across northern France, Luftwaffe pilots listened in silence as casualty lists were read aloud. The arrogance that once filled their barracks, the jokes about flying against junk, had disappeared completely. Those who survived spoke differently now. They no longer laughed at the hurricanes, they feared them. Because every time they crossed the channel, no matter the hour, no matter how many of them came, the same thing happened. The old junk rose from the fields of Kent and Sussex, climbed into the sun, and tore their formations apart. And for the first time, the Luftwaffe realized that Britain's survival didn't depend on new technology or superior machines. It depended on the stubborn endurance of a fighter that refused to die. By late September 1940, the Battle of Britain had entered its most decisive phase. The Luftwaffe had thrown nearly everything it had into the campaign. Hundreds of bombers, the best fighter squadrons in Europe, and the full confidence of its leadership. Yet the RAF still stood. The German High Command now faced a grim reality. Despite weeks of bombing, despite the destruction and the exhaustion, British Fighter Command had not broken. And at the heart of that defiance was the Hurricane, the aircraft that Göring's pilots once dismissed as a relic of the past. At forward airfields across southern England, the reality of the air war was now brutally clear. Hurricanes landed with smoke streaming from bullet holes, cockpits shattered, fabric burned and peeling from their wings. Mechanics dragged hoses across the grass, pulling out fire extinguishers before the aircraft even came to a stop. Every landing was a gamble. Many pilots had to climb out before their aircraft caught fire completely. Yet as soon as one hurricane was pulled off the line, another taxied forward to take its place. Number 85 Squadron at Croydon was one of many living that rhythm. Between dawn and dusk, its pilots scrambled 8 to 10 times a day. Each sortie lasted barely 20 minutes, just long enough to intercept incoming bombers before running low on fuel. The men rarely had time to eat. Sandwiches were brought directly to the revetments by ground crew. Mechanics worked on the same aircraft while their pilots stood beside them, waiting for a refuel or a new ammunition belt to be fitted. Conditions were brutal, but efficiency reached levels that shocked even senior RAF officers. Hurricanes could be rearmed and refueled in under 12 minutes. Bullet holes were patched with layers of dope and canvas. Entire wings were swapped in an hour. The simplicity that had made the Hurricane look outdated now made it invaluable. As Luftwaffe losses climbed, Göring grew increasingly furious. At briefings in France, he accused his commanders of cowardice, demanding that they press the attack with more determination. He blamed bomber crews for poor formation flying and fighter escorts for abandoning their charges too early. But the pilots on the front line knew the truth. The RAF's tactics, and especially the resilience of the Hurricane squadrons, had made their missions nearly suicidal. Intercepted German transmissions revealed growing dissent among Luftwaffe pilots. They complained about having to face an enemy that never stops coming. Some bomber commanders admitted privately that morale was collapsing. "The English fight to the last plane," one wrote in a field report. "They rise from airfields we bombed yesterday and meet us again today." That same week, the Hurricanes began to shift from pure defense to controlled aggression. Fighter Command realized that the Luftwaffe was bleeding. Instead of waiting for bombers to approach London, British squadrons began intercepting them over the Channel. The goal was to force engagements earlier, to disrupt formations before they could even reach the coast. On September 23rd, one such interception near Dungeness turned into one of the most intense battles of the campaign. A formation of Heinkel Hehe 111s, escorted by nearly 50 Bf 109s, was spotted heading for the Kent coast. 2 Hurricane squadrons were vectored toward them. The engagement that followed stretched across 20 miles of sky. Hurricanes attacked in pairs, breaking through the escorts to reach the bombers. Many were hit, some severely, but they pressed on relentlessly. In less than half an hour, 7 bombers fell into the sea, burning. Another 4 limped home with 1 engine. A captured German airman later told interrogators, "They came through the flak like madmen. We could not shake them off." But those victories came at a cost. Many Hurricane pilots were now barely able to stand from fatigue. Some had flown over 100 sorties in a month. Their eyes burned from lack of sleep, their hands trembled after landing, yet when the scramble bell rang, they still ran for their aircraft. The pace of the fighting began to push every part of Fighter Command to its limit. Fuel depots were dangerously low, spare engines almost gone. Replacement aircraft arrived in crates from factories across the country, sometimes incomplete, with missing panels or misaligned parts. It didn't matter. Crews assembled them overnight, sanding and riveting until dawn, determined to get one more Hurricane airborne by morning. Meanwhile, the civilian population endured nightly raids that left entire neighborhoods in ruins. The Blitz had begun. Londoners watched as the city burned, but they also knew that every day their defenders in the sky were inflicting heavy punishment on the enemy. The Hurricanes became a symbol, not glamorous, not sleek, but unyielding. Newspaper headlines focused on their achievements, naming individual pilots, showing photographs of battered aircraft still flying. One of those stories came from RAF Tangmere, where a pilot landed with his aircraft riddled by cannon shells. The propeller was damaged, one wing half shredded. When ground crews examined it, they discovered that the main spar, the structural beam holding the wings together, had cracked nearly in half. Yet somehow, the Hurricane had held long enough to bring its pilot home. Even Churchill, who privately worried about Britain's endurance, took notice. In one meeting, he reportedly pointed to a photograph of a Hurricane and said, "This aircraft has saved us more times than we can count." In Germany, Göring's staff grew desperate. They began introducing new bomber routes, night operations, and diversionary raids in an attempt to confuse radar and exhaust the RAF. But Dowding's system, radar stations, filter rooms, and the coordination between sectors remained intact. And every time the Germans adapted, the RAF responded. The turning point came on the 25th, when poor weather forced many German formations to turn back. For the RAF, it was a brief respite, the first in weeks. Yet instead of resting, the airfields used the lull to rebuild. Hurricanes were repaired, engines replaced, and replacement pilots trained in real combat tactics. By the next clear day, Britain's defensive network was stronger than it had been in months. The Luftwaffe didn't know it yet, but their campaign had already failed. What they saw as a week's pause was in reality the RAF's recovery. The Hurricanes that had limped home shot to pieces were being patched, repainted, and made ready again. By the time German bombers reappeared over the Channel, the RAF was waiting for them, stronger, faster in response, and more coordinated than ever before. The Hurricanes that rose from those battered fields were no longer the same as they had been at the start of the summer. Their pilots had seen too much. Their aircraft carried scars from hundreds of engagements. But they had learned. The tactics were sharper, the communication flawless, and the resolve absolute. The Luftwaffe's next assault, what they expected to be the final decisive strike, would instead become their most humiliating defeat. And when that moment came, it would prove once and for all that the aircraft mocked as old junk had changed the course of the war. By the first week of October 1940, the German High Command was running out of explanations. Every chart and report that reached Berlin told the same story. Luftwaffe losses were unsustainable. 50 aircraft in 7 days. Entire formations wiped out. What Göring's intelligence officers had promised would be an easy, systematic crushing of Britain's amateur air force had turned into a disaster. The RAF's backbone, the Hawker Hurricane, was supposed to be outdated, slow, and fragile compared to the Messerschmitt Bf 109. But in the air over southern England, that old junk had just humiliated the most powerful air arm in Europe. In southern England, the frontline airfields that had been bombed into near ruin weeks earlier were now fully functional again. Biggin Hill, North Weald, and Tangmere were operating at near full capacity. Fighter Command's decentralized repair network, a mix of RAF workshops and civilian factories, had worked miracles. Hurricanes damaged on Monday were back in the sky by Thursday. At one repair site in Surrey, workers slept beside their benches, using lamps powered by car batteries during blackouts to keep production running through the night. Every available carpenter, welder, and mechanic had become part of Britain's defense system. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. The German pilots who had once mocked the British for flying on luck now began asking uncomfortable questions about why their own luck had vanished. The answer was simple. The RAF was adapting faster. The Germans still followed rigid formation tactics, operating with precision but little flexibility. The Hurricanes, guided by Dowding's command system, struck from multiple directions at once. Ground control vectors were becoming razor-accurate. Radar operators could now plot formations with near-perfect timing, directing Hurricanes to hit the bombers before they reached London. The shift was most visible on October 7th, when No. 257 Squadron, under squadron leader Bob Stanford Tuck, intercepted a large formation of Heinkels over the Thames estuary. Within minutes, the sky turned into chaos. Hurricanes dove through the German escort screen, ignoring the fighters and going straight for the bombers. It was brutal, direct, and effective. 6 Heinkels went down in less than 15 minutes. German gunners reported being attacked from all sides by aircraft that refused to break off. The mission collapsed before the bombers even reached their target. Back in France, Göring's frustration reached boiling point. In one infamous meeting at his headquarters in Harrenhal, he lashed out at his senior officers. "You promised me the English would be finished in 4 weeks," he shouted, slamming his fist against the table. "Now we're the ones being hunted." He accused his fighter commanders of lacking aggression and his bomber wings of cowardice. But what no one dared say aloud was that the British system, from radar operators to fuel truck drivers, had turned every raid into a battle the Luftwaffe couldn't afford to fight. By the second week of October, the psychological shift was complete. German crews who once sang patriotic songs before takeoff now sat in silence, staring at the cold dawn over their airfields in northern France. They called the skies over England the Dot Zone, the death zone. Reports from captured pilots revealed the same pattern: exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. One Luftwaffe navigator, taken prisoner near Brighton, told his interrogators that the English always know where we are. It's as if they can see us through the clouds. He was right. Chain-home radar had made surprise impossible. For the men flying Hurricanes, that intelligence meant survival. Instead of being caught scrambling blindly into combat, they now had minutes to prepare. The ground crews fueled and armed the aircraft in record time, and the pilots were airborne with clear intercept vectors. They didn't know it then, but this combination, early detection, fast turnaround, and relentless counterattacks, was bleeding the Luftwaffe dry. The numbers told the truth even Göring couldn't deny. Between October 5th and 12th, Luftwaffe losses hit levels unseen since the start of the campaign. 50 aircraft destroyed, dozens more heavily damaged. The RAF lost fewer than half that number. German propaganda attempted to conceal the disaster, but word spread through the ranks. Bomber crews began requesting transfers, citing navigational errors to avoid long-range missions into British airspace. Fighter groups resorted to shorter patrols, unwilling to chase hurricanes deep inland where fuel limits left them vulnerable. Meanwhile, British pilots, exhausted but emboldened, began to fight with new confidence. Many had entered the summer as rookies. Now they were hardened veterans who knew exactly how to exploit their aircraft's strengths. The Hurricane's stability in a turn, its ability to soak up damage, and its rugged construction gave them an edge in prolonged dogfights. A Bf-109 could outrun it, but not outlast it. And the RAF's tactics, attack from below, break through formations, strike the bombers first, were paying off. In one particularly fierce engagement near Maidstone on October 11th, a single Hurricane squadron broke up a raid of 30 German bombers, downing 9 in less than half an hour. When the surviving crews returned to their base at Calais, they found their own hangars full of wrecks. One pilot, writing in his diary that night, admitted, "We have lost too many. We were told they were finished. They are not." By now, the RAF's endurance had taken on an almost mythic quality. London was still burning nightly under the Blitz, but the hurricanes continued to rise each morning. Mechanics worked through the raids, hammering and welding under the glow of the fires in the distance. Some squadrons even painted personal messages on their aircraft, short, defiant phrases like "still here" or "not done yet." Every loss was met with another aircraft taking off. Every raid that failed to break them only deepened the resolve of those still fighting. In Germany, the tone of reports changed entirely. No longer filled with confidence, they now spoke of attrition and doubt. One report to the Luftwaffe General Staff admitted, "Enemy defenses show no sign of collapse. Losses are severe. Morale among bomber units is deteriorating." Göring, once so sure of victory, began quietly pulling squadrons back to the continent. His focus shifted to night raids, hoping darkness would hide his bombers from the hurricanes and radar alike. But even that strategy would soon fail, because the same aircraft the Germans had dismissed as obsolete had done the impossible. It had outlasted them. The Hurricane had become the workhorse of Britain's survival, the shield that absorbed the worst of the Luftwaffe's fury and still came back for more. And by the time the last daylight raids over England faded into history, one fact was undeniable. The amateurs had broken the professionals. The Luftwaffe had lost 50 aircraft in a single week, and with them, the illusion of German air superiority. The aircraft mocked as old junk had become the machine that saved a nation.